In the summer of 1919, America faced one of the most intense and devastating waves of racial violence in its history, a period now known as the Red Summer. Over the course of just a few months, more than 36 cities across the nation were engulfed in violent racial riots that left hundreds of Black Americans dead and countless communities shattered. These tragic events unfolded in the aftermath of World War I, at a time when hopes for progress and equality were rising but met with fierce resistance. The Red Summer was not a series of isolated incidents, but rather a widespread eruption of tension rooted in deep social, economic, and political issues. Black veterans returning from the war expected to be welcomed as heroes, only to find that discrimination and hostility awaited them at home. At the same time, the Great Migration brought millions of African Americans from the rural South to industrial cities in the North, seeking better opportunities but often encountering prejudice and violent backlash. This period exposed the harsh realities of systemic racism and white supremacy, revealing how fear, misinformation, and competition for jobs fueled devastating clashes between communities. The violence was not limited to one region or city, it spread like wildfire, leaving scars that would take generations to heal. Today, the Red Summer remains a lesser-known chapter of American history, overshadowed by other events but no less important. Understanding what happened during those months is crucial, as it helps us recognize the long-standing struggles for justice and equality that continue to shape our society. In this video, we will uncover the untold stories behind the Red Summer of 1919, examining its causes, major incidents, and lasting impact. We will hear about the courage of Black communities who stood up to violence and the role of organizations that fought tirelessly for civil rights in the face of overwhelming opposition. If you want to learn more about this pivotal moment and why it matters today, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps bring important history to light and keeps these stories alive for future generations. Do not forget to turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Let us dive deep into the Red Summer of 1919, a story of struggle, resilience, and the ongoing fight for justice in America. The violent upheaval of the Red Summer in 1919 cannot be fully understood without first looking at the deep tensions that simmered beneath the surface of American society in the aftermath of World War I. The war had just ended, and millions of men, Black and white alike, were returning home, carrying with them the hopes of a new beginning. For African American veterans, the experience was especially complex, having fought bravely and sacrificed for a country that promised liberty and justice. They anticipated a transformed society where their service would earn them respect and equality. Yet, the reality they faced upon returning was starkly different, filled with betrayal and disillusionment. Instead of gratitude, Black veterans were met with persistent racial discrimination that permeated every aspect of life. They returned not to open arms but to communities still deeply divided by prejudice and hostility. Jobs were scarce, and economic instability gripped the nation as industries struggled to shift from wartime production to peacetime economies. White veterans, too, faced hardships, but many saw Black workers and migrants as threats to their livelihoods. This sense of competition created a volatile environment ripe for conflict. The Great Migration, which had been underway for several years before the war, accelerated during and after the conflict, as millions of African Americans left the oppressive conditions of the rural South in search of better opportunities in northern industrial cities. Cities like Chicago, Detroit, and New York saw their Black populations swell dramatically. This demographic shift unsettled many white residents who feared losing control over jobs, housing, and social status. The arrival of new neighbors challenging the status quo stirred anxieties that quickly morphed into resentment and hostility. What made this period especially combustible was the clash of expectations. Black veterans returned with a sense of pride and a determination to claim the rights they had fought for. refusing to accept the Jim Crow-era limitations that sought to confine them. They wanted to live with dignity, to hold good jobs, and to participate fully in the American dream. Meanwhile, white Americans, grappling with their own post-war struggles, often reacted with fear and aggression, determined to maintain the social hierarchies that had long favored them. Economic pressures only deepened the divide. The post-war recession hit many working-class Americans hard, and competition for employment became fierce. Black workers were often relegated to the lowest-paying, most unstable jobs. Yet even these positions became points of contention as white workers viewed African Americans as strikebreakers or unwelcome rivals. This tension was not simply about jobs. It was about power, control, and the fear of losing long-held privileges. Layered on top of economic anxiety was the unrelenting force of white supremacy, which shaped attitudes and policies nationwide. The system was designed to keep Black Americans in a subordinate position, and any challenge to this order was met with swift and often violent retaliation. The media played a significant role in inflaming racial tensions, frequently publishing sensationalized and racist portrayals of Black individuals as threats to social order. These narratives fed fears within white communities and justified brutal responses to any perceived challenge. In this charged atmosphere, even minor incidents could spark widespread violence. The combination of economic competition, racial animosity, and the unresolved trauma of war created a powder keg waiting for a spark. Black communities, emboldened by their service and by a growing sense of agency, were less willing to accept injustice silently. Yet, their assertions of dignity were often misinterpreted as threats, leading to violent backlash from white mobs, sometimes with the complicity or direct involvement of local authorities. The story of the Red Summer is thus one of clashing hopes and fears, of a nation struggling to define itself in the wake of a global conflict. It was a moment when the promises of democracy and equality were tested brutally against the realities of entrenched racism and economic uncertainty. The violence that erupted was not simply random or spontaneous. It was the result of years of unresolved tensions and systemic inequalities coming to a head. Understanding this context is crucial because it reveals the complexity behind the tragedy of the Red Summer. It was more than a series of riots. It was a reflection of the nation's failure to reconcile its ideals with its practices. The experiences of Black veterans returning to hostility and economic hardship underscore how far the country still had to go toward achieving true equality. This period also highlights the resilience of Black communities who, despite facing violent opposition, organized themselves to protect their neighborhoods and demand their rights. Their courage in the face of such adversity laid important groundwork for future civil rights activism. In telling this story, we confront uncomfortable truths about America's past, a past where race, power, and economic anxiety intertwined to ignite one of the most violent chapters in the nation's history. But by understanding these forces, we also gain insight into the ongoing struggles for justice and equity that continue to shape society today. The Great Migration stands as one of the most transformative movements in American history, reshaping the social and economic landscape of the nation and intensifying the racial tensions that culminated in the Red Summer of 1919. For decades, African Americans endured the harsh realities of life in the rural South, living under the oppressive weight of Jim Crow laws, economic exploitation, and constant threats of violence. Seeking escape from this entrenched system of racial injustice, millions made the courageous decision to leave behind their homes, families, and familiar surroundings to journey northward in search of opportunity, freedom, and dignity. This mass movement was not simply about relocation. It was a profound demographic shift that altered the very fabric of cities like Chicago, Detroit, New York, and St. Louis. As African Americans settled into these industrial hubs, they brought with them vibrant cultures, ambitions, and a desire to claim a rightful place in American society. Yet, their arrival disrupted the existing social order in ways that many white residents found deeply unsettling. These cities, already struggling to accommodate rapid growth and change, now faced the challenge of integrating a large influx of newcomers who were seen by some as economic competitors and social outsiders. The tension born from this demographic upheaval was a powder keg waiting to ignite. The industrial boom had created jobs, but these opportunities were limited and fiercely contested. White workers, many of them immigrants or recent veterans themselves, feared that the new arrivals would undercut their wages or take their jobs entirely. Employers sometimes exploited this divide by hiring black workers as strikebreakers during labor disputes, further inflaming animosities and dividing the working class along racial lines. This tactic not only deepened economic competition, but also sowed distrust and resentment between black and white laborers who might otherwise have found common cause. Housing was another battleground where the effects of the Great Migration were starkly visible. Black migrants were often confined to overcrowded, segregated neighborhoods with limited access to quality services and infrastructure. These areas became both centers of community life and flashpoints of racial hostility. As black populations grew, white residents and landlords frequently responded with hostility, using intimidation, restrictive covenants, and violence to maintain racial boundaries. The overcrowded conditions and inadequate housing options only heightened the stresses within these communities, creating an environment where small conflicts could escalate quickly. Culturally, the Great Migration sparked a renaissance of black life and expression in the North, which in turn challenged long-held stereotypes and prejudices. The rise of black newspapers, jazz music, and artistic movements in cities like Harlem introduced new narratives of black identity and achievement that contrasted sharply with the limited and often derogatory portrayals found in mainstream media. While these cultural shifts fostered pride and solidarity within black communities, they also provoked fear and backlash from those unwilling to accept the changing dynamics of American society. Within this complex environment, the seeds for the Red Summer's violent outbreaks were sown. The rapid demographic changes unsettled white communities who perceived black progress and assertiveness as direct threats to their social and economic dominance. Rumors, misinformation, and inflammatory rhetoric spread quickly, creating a climate ripe for conflict. In many cities, seemingly minor incidents, whether disputed space on a beach, an allegation against a black individual, or a labor dispute, became catalysts for widespread violence. The Great Migration also altered the political landscape, as African Americans in the North began to exert greater influence in local elections and civic life. This political awakening, while still limited in scope due to systemic barriers, represented a challenge to entrenched power structures and heightened anxieties among white populations determined to preserve their authority. The combination of increased political assertiveness, economic competition, and cultural visibility created a volatile mixture that exploded during the summer of 1919. What makes the Great Migration so pivotal to understanding the Red Summer is that it highlights how social change, while necessary and hopeful, can provoke intense resistance when it threatens established hierarchies. The violence was not merely about individual acts of hatred. It was about a broader struggle over the future direction of American society. The migrants' pursuit of better lives illuminated the country's unfinished promises of freedom and equality and exposed the deep-rooted opposition to those ideals. Despite the challenges and dangers they faced, the migrants of the Great Migration displayed remarkable resilience and determination. They built vibrant communities, nurtured cultural innovation, and laid the foundations for future civil rights activism. Their stories are a testament to the enduring human spirit and the ongoing quest for justice in the face of adversity. In retelling this chapter of history, we see how the Great Migration set the stage for one of the most turbulent and defining moments in America's racial history. It was a movement that reshaped cities, challenged prejudices, and ultimately forced the nation to confront its contradictions. Understanding this mass migration allows us to appreciate the complexity of the Red Summer, not just as a series of violent events, but as part of a larger narrative about change, conflict, and hope in American life. The violent clashes of the Red Summer in 1919 were not random outbursts of anger or isolated incidents of racial tension. Rather, they were deeply rooted in a long-standing system of white supremacist ideology and systemic racism that shaped American society from its very foundations. This belief in white superiority permeated every aspect of life, influencing laws, social norms, economic opportunities, and even the narratives presented in the media. Understanding this context is essential to grasp why the violence was so widespread, so brutal, and so devastating to African American communities. White supremacy in the early 20th century was not simply an undercurrent, but a driving force behind policies and practices designed to maintain racial hierarchies and deny Black Americans their rightful place in society. The Jim Crow laws in the South codified segregation and disenfranchisement, creating a legal framework that upheld racial inequality and violence. But the ideology of white supremacy extended far beyond the South. It was deeply embedded in the attitudes and institutions of the North as well, where many African Americans sought refuge during the Great Migration. The media played a crucial role in reinforcing and spreading white supremacist beliefs. Newspapers, films, and other forms of popular culture frequently depicted Black people through a distorted and harmful lens, portraying them as dangerous, criminal, or morally suspect. This biased representation was not incidental but deliberate, serving to justify discriminatory laws and violent actions against Black communities. One of the most infamous examples was the 1915 film The Birth of a Nation, which glorified the Ku Klux Klan and depicted Black men as threats to white women and social order, fueling fears and hatred across the country. In everyday news coverage, many white-owned newspapers sensationalized stories of alleged Black criminality or attacks on white citizens, often without evidence or context. These reports inflamed public opinion and created a climate of fear and suspicion that paved the way for violent reprisals. When violence erupted, the media often blamed Black victims and portrayed white mobs as protectors of their communities, further distorting the truth and shielding perpetrators from accountability. This systemic racism was not limited to media portrayals, but was reflected in the actions of law enforcement and government officials, who frequently sided with white aggressors or failed to intervene effectively to protect Black citizens. Police officers in cities like Chicago and Washington, D.C. were often complicit in the violence, turning a blind eye to attacks on Black neighborhoods or actively participating in the suppression of Black resistance. The legal system too was skewed, with Black defendants facing unfair trials and harsh sentences, as seen in the aftermath of the Elaine massacre, where Black sharecroppers were falsely accused and unjustly punished for defending their rights. The combination of these forces, white supremacist ideology, biased media, complicit law enforcement, and systemic legal injustice, created an environment where violence against African Americans was not only tolerated but, in many cases, encouraged. The widespread racial riots during the Red Summer were thus expressions of a society deeply divided by race, struggling to maintain an unequal status quo in the face of Black demands for justice and equality. Despite these overwhelming challenges, Black communities did not remain passive. Many organized to protect their neighborhoods, resist oppression, and challenge the false narratives perpetuated by the mainstream media. Black newspapers such as the Chicago Defender, The Crisis, and the New York Age became vital voices, reporting the truth about the violence, highlighting Black achievements, and advocating for civil rights. These publications played an essential role in countering the dominant racist discourse and giving African Americans a platform to tell their own stories. Moreover, civil rights organizations like the NAACP mobilized efforts to investigate the riots, raise awareness, and push for federal legislation against lynching and racial violence. Leaders such as E.B. Du Bois and James Weldon Johnson recognized that the struggle was not just local but national, requiring a coordinated response to the systemic forces underpinning the violence. Their activism during and after the Red Summer laid important groundwork for the civil rights movements that would follow in the decades ahead. The Red Summer revealed the depth and pervasiveness of racial injustice in America, how white supremacy was woven into the very institutions meant to ensure fairness and protection for all citizens. It also exposed the dangerous power of the media in shaping public perception and influencing social attitudes, a lesson that remains relevant today. By understanding these dynamics, we gain insight into why the violence was so intense and why the fight for equality required not only courage on the streets but also a battle to change hearts, minds, and laws. This painful chapter in American history reminds us that racism is not merely about individual prejudice but about systemic structures that perpetuate inequality and violence. The legacy of the Red Summer challenges us to confront these realities honestly and work toward a society where justice and dignity are truly universal. Among the many violent episodes that marked the Red Summer of 1919, 3 stand out as particularly significant for their scale, intensity, and lasting impact: the Chicago Race Riot, the Washington, D.C. Riot, and the Elaine Massacre in Arkansas. Each of these events not only revealed the brutal realities of racial hatred and systemic injustice, but also illustrated how different communities faced unique challenges in the fight for dignity and survival during this turbulent time. The Chicago Race Riot erupted in late July 1919, ignited by a seemingly small but tragic incident on a hot summer day. Eugene Williams, a 17-year-old African-American boy, accidentally drifted into a whites-only section of Lake Michigan's beach. What followed was an attack by white beachgoers who began throwing stones, ultimately leading to Williams drowning. Instead of protecting the victim or holding the perpetrators accountable, the police arrested a black man, fueling outrage within the African-American community. The ensuing violence spiraled quickly, with white mobs roaming black neighborhoods, setting homes ablaze, looting businesses, and attacking residents. Black Chicagoans, many of whom were veterans hardened by the experiences of World War I, organized to defend their communities fiercely. For nearly a week, the city was engulfed in chaos, the streets stained with blood and fear. The riot reflected the deep-seated resentment caused by rapid demographic changes due to the Great Migration, economic competition, and entrenched segregation that confined black residents to overcrowded and dilapidated neighborhoods. When the violence subsided, the toll was devastating: 38 people dead, 23 black and 15 white, hundreds injured, and thousands of black families left homeless. While Chicago grappled with its own tragedy, the nation's capital became another epicenter of racial violence during the same summer. In Washington, D.C., a series of unverified accusations alleging assaults by black men on white women ignited fear and fury among white veterans and residents. Emboldened by racist rhetoric and fueled by anger, white mobs formed groups to patrol black neighborhoods, seeking revenge. Unlike in many other cities, African Americans in Washington had organized self-defense efforts, with black veterans taking up arms to protect their families and communities. These armed defenders returned fire against attacks, signaling a refusal to remain passive victims. However, the violence still raged for nearly a week, leaving 15 dead, 10 white and 5 black, and hundreds more injured. The local police were often overwhelmed or complicit, and the federal government's delayed intervention underscored the systemic neglect and complicity that characterized much of the Red Summer's violence. The Washington, D.C. riot exposed the stark reality that racial violence was not confined to the South or rural areas, but existed at the heart of American political power. Far more brutal and tragic was the Elaine massacre in rural Arkansas, which unfolded in late September and early October 1919. Unlike the race riots in the urban north, the violence in Elaine was sparked by a labor dispute. Black sharecroppers, exhausted by exploitative conditions, organized to demand fair wages for their cotton labor and formed a union to negotiate better terms with white landowners who held sway over the region. Tensions escalated on the night of September 30th when a meeting of black sharecroppers at church was disrupted by white men, including law enforcement officers. Amid the confusion, shots were fired, and a white man was killed. This event sparked a violent and brutal crackdown led by local authorities, white vigilantes, and federal troops, who launched a deadly campaign against the black community. Over the following days, entire families were hunted down, homes and buildings burned, and black residents were slaughtered in what can only be described as a massacre rather than a riot. Official reports estimated that between 100 and 200 black people lost their lives, while only 5 white men died. In the aftermath, over 60 black men were arrested and charged with inciting violence. Despite having been the victims of a white-led attack, 12 were sentenced to death in sham trials that starkly revealed the racial injustices embedded in the legal system. It was not until 1923 that the U.S. Supreme Court overturned these convictions in the landmark Moore v. Dempsey case, highlighting the gross violations of due process. Together, these 3 events represent the devastating scope of the Red Summer and the different ways racial violence manifested across America. From urban neighborhoods filled with industrial workers to rural communities fighting for basic labor rights, African Americans faced threats not only from hostile individuals but from systemic forces that sought to maintain white dominance at any cost. The riots and massacre were tragic reminders of how far the nation had yet to go in fulfilling its promises of freedom, equality, and justice. But amid the bloodshed and destruction, stories of resistance and courage also emerged. Black veterans and civilians alike refused to accept victimhood passively, organizing self-defense groups and advocating for justice. The outrage sparked by these events fueled early civil rights activism and galvanized organizations such as the NAACP to press for change. The legacy of the Chicago race riot, Washington, D. riot, and Elaine massacre is thus twofold: a testament to the deep wounds inflicted by racial hatred, and a powerful reminder of the resilience and determination of Black Americans in their ongoing struggle for dignity and equality. By examining these incidents closely, we gain a clearer understanding of the complexities and nuances of the Red Summer, moving beyond simple headlines to grasp the human stories, the systemic failures, and the enduring impact on American society. These events call us to remember, reflect, and recommit to the work of building a more just and inclusive future. The city of Chicago in the summer of 1919 became a fiery battleground, where long-simmering tensions between black and white residents exploded into a brutal and deadly riot that lasted for nearly a week. At the heart of this eruption was a tragic and deeply symbolic incident: the drowning of Eugene Williams, a 17-year-old black teenager whose death sparked outrage and violence that would engulf the city. On a hot July day, Williams had unknowingly crossed into a whites-only section of a popular Lake Michigan beach, a boundary rigidly enforced by the segregationist attitudes of the time. When white beachgoers spotted him in what they considered their territory, they began hurling stones, one of which struck Williams and caused him to lose consciousness and drown. What made this tragedy all the more painful and infuriating was the response from law enforcement. Instead of arresting those responsible for attacking Williams, the police charged a black man, an injustice that ignited a powder keg of frustration and anger within the African American community. This single act of racial violence and the failure of authorities to seek justice was not an isolated incident, but a spark that set off a series of violent clashes between black and white residents that quickly escalated beyond the beach. Over the following days, white mobs roamed through predominantly black neighborhoods on Chicago's South Side, burning homes, looting businesses, and attacking anyone they encountered. These mobs were often armed and driven by a determination to reassert white dominance in a city undergoing rapid demographic changes due to the Great Migration, where thousands of African Americans had moved north in search of jobs and better living conditions. The increasing black population challenged the social and economic status quo, stoking resentment among white residents fearful of losing jobs and neighborhoods. The black residents, many of whom were veterans hardened by the brutality and sacrifices of World War I, were not willing to stand idly by as their communities were under siege. Organized groups of black men armed themselves to defend their homes and families, fiercely resisting the white mobs. These confrontations often turned deadly, with both sides engaging in violent clashes that transformed the city streets into battlegrounds. The riot revealed a new level of black militancy and refusal to accept subjugation, signaling a shift in how African Americans confronted racial oppression. For many black veterans, their wartime service had imbued them with a renewed sense of dignity and a readiness to fight for their rights on American soil. Despite the scale of the violence, the police response was inadequate and at times complicit. Many officers either refused to intervene or actively sided with white rioters, leaving black neighborhoods vulnerable to destruction and assault. This failure of law enforcement further deepened the wounds of racial injustice and heightened the sense of betrayal felt by black Chicagoans. The media coverage of the riot was often biased, framing the violence as mutual or attributing blame disproportionately to black residents, while downplaying the aggression of white mobs. By the time the violence subsided, the toll was devastating. 38 people had lost their lives, 23 black and 15 white, and over 500 individuals were injured. Thousands of black families were left homeless as significant portions of their neighborhoods lay in ashes. The physical and emotional scars of the Chicago race riot would linger for years, a stark reminder of the racial divisions that fractured the city and the nation. The riot was not just about the tragic death of Eugene Williams. It was a manifestation of broader social and economic conflicts that had been building for years. The rapid growth of black communities through the Great Migration intensified competition for jobs, housing, and political power, unsettling established white residents. Segregation confined black residents to overcrowded and often neglected areas, where they faced constant discrimination and limited opportunities. These conditions, combined with the failure of institutions to protect all citizens equally, created an environment ripe for conflict. What sets the Chicago race riot apart from other racial conflicts of the era is the organized and determined resistance by black citizens, particularly the veterans who brought their military experience to the streets. This resistance challenged the assumption that African Americans would remain passive in the face of violence and marked an important moment in the broader struggle for civil rights. The riot exposed the deep fractures in American society and underscored the urgent need for social change. Reflecting on this episode in history, we are reminded that moments of tragedy can also become catalysts for awareness and activism. The Chicago race riot was a painful chapter, but it also revealed the courage and resilience of a community fighting for justice and recognition. It calls us to confront the legacies of racial violence and to work toward a future where such divisions no longer lead to bloodshed but to understanding and equality. In the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., the summer of 1919 unfolded as a tense and dangerous chapter marked by a wave of racial violence that would leave scars on the city and expose the deep racial divisions that plagued America. The violence was sparked by a series of rumors and unverified accusations that black men had assaulted white women, claims that quickly spread through the white community and ignited a fierce backlash. Fueled by these allegations, white veterans who had recently returned from World War I took matters into their own hands, forming groups that roamed black neighborhoods with the intent of retaliating against what they perceived as threats to their social order. These men, hardened by the experience of war and emboldened by racist rhetoric circulating in newspapers and public discourse, believed they were defending their city and their race, though their actions would only deepen the cycle of violence and fear. Unlike many other cities caught up in the Red Summer's turmoil, Washington's black community was better prepared to resist this wave of attacks. Many African American veterans, who had fought bravely overseas and returned with a strengthened sense of dignity and resolve, took up arms to protect their families and neighborhoods from the encroaching mobs. These veterans, familiar with discipline and combat, organized themselves quickly, forming defensive lines to guard against violent assaults. The image of black men, once stereotyped as passive victims, now standing firmly with rifles in hand, ready to defend their homes, marked a powerful moment of resistance and defiance against systemic oppression. The conflict quickly escalated into a violent and chaotic clash that engulfed parts of the city for nearly a week. Streets that had been bustling with everyday life were transformed into battlegrounds where gunfire echoed and lives were lost. The violence was brutal, leaving both white and black residents injured and dead. Official reports later recorded 15 fatalities, 10 white and 5 black, and hundreds more wounded in the confrontation. The fact that black residents were willing and able to defend themselves challenged the dominant narrative that portrayed African Americans as mere victims or threats, forcing the broader society to reckon with a changing dynamic in the struggle for civil rights and social justice. Despite the intensity of the violence, the response from law enforcement was insufficient and, in many cases, questionable. Local police forces were often overwhelmed by the scale of the riots, and numerous reports indicated that some officers were complicit in the violence, or at least reluctant to intervene on behalf of black citizens. The federal government, located just blocks away, delayed intervention, sending troops only after the situation had spiraled dangerously out of control. This lack of prompt and impartial action underscored the systemic failures that allowed racial violence to fester and highlighted the institutional biases deeply embedded in American governance. The Washington, D.C. riot also revealed how racial violence was not confined to the rural South or economically depressed areas but was a pervasive problem that reached the very seat of American power. The city was a symbol of national ideals, justice, equality, and democracy, yet beneath this facade, racial injustice and segregation were painfully evident. African Americans in the capital faced daily discrimination in housing, employment, and public accommodations, creating an environment of frustration and tension that contributed to the eruption of violence. The racial hostility that exploded during the Red Summer was an expression of these unresolved conflicts. The resistance shown by black veterans and civilians during the Washington, D.C. riot was emblematic of a broader shift occurring throughout the country. Having served their nation with valor in World War I, African Americans returned home with heightened expectations for respect, rights, and opportunities. Yet, they were met with hostility, discrimination, and violence instead. The willingness of black veterans to defend their communities signaled a refusal to accept second-class citizenship and a readiness to challenge the racial status quo. This moment would resonate in the decades to come, inspiring future generations in the ongoing fight for civil rights. Media coverage of the riots varied widely, with many mainstream outlets focusing on alleged black criminality and portraying white rioters as protectors, perpetuating harmful stereotypes and justifying violence. In contrast, black-owned newspapers provided critical accounts of the events, highlighting the courage of black residents and the injustice of the attacks. These differing narratives illustrate the power of media in shaping public perception and the importance of diverse voices in telling the full story. The Washington, D.C. riot of 1919 remains a significant episode in American history, reflecting the complex interplay of racial fear, economic anxiety, and social change that characterized the post-World War I era. it forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nation's past and the long struggle for racial equality and justice. Remembering this event is essential not only to honor those who fought to defend their communities, but also to understand the ongoing challenges that arise when systemic racism and prejudice go unaddressed. The lessons of Washington, D.C. in 1919 remind us that the fight for justice requires vigilance, courage, and an unwavering commitment to equality for all. In the quiet rural town of Elaine, Arkansas, far removed from the urban battlegrounds of Chicago and Washington, D.C., a different but equally harrowing chapter of the Red Summer of 1919 was unfolding, a chapter marked by brutal suppression, injustice, and profound tragedy. Here, the violence stemmed not only from racial hatred, but also from a fierce struggle for economic justice that threatened to upend the deeply entrenched social order of the South. Black sharecroppers, who toiled endlessly under oppressive and exploitative conditions on white-owned lands, had finally decided to take a stand and demand fair wages for their cotton labor. Their determination to organize and form a union was an act of courage that challenged the very foundations of white supremacy in the region. The tensions reached a breaking point on the night of September 30th, 1919, when a group of black sharecroppers gathered at a church to discuss their labor rights and plan their next steps. This meeting, meant to be a peaceful assembly for workers seeking justice, was disrupted by white men, including local law enforcement officers, who attempted to break up the gathering. Shots were fired during the confrontation, and a white man was killed amid the chaos. This tragic event ignited a devastating chain reaction of violence that would leave the community scarred for generations. In the immediate aftermath, local authorities, white vigilantes, and federal troops descended upon Elaine with a single-minded purpose: to crush what they called an uprising of black farmers. What followed was not a riot in the conventional sense, but a massacre. An organized campaign of terror and slaughter targeting black men, women, and children. Entire families were hunted down and killed. Homes and churches burned to the ground, and anyone suspected of supporting the Union became a target for violence and intimidation. The scale of the bloodshed was staggering. Official estimates suggest that between 100 and 200 black residents lost their lives, although some accounts place the number even higher. By contrast, only 5 white men died during the massacre, underscoring the one-sided nature of this brutal repression. The violence was compounded by a grotesque miscarriage of justice that followed. Over 60 black men were arrested and charged with inciting the violence, despite overwhelming evidence that they were the victims rather than the aggressors. In what became known as a sham trial, 12 of these men were sentenced to death, a stark testament to the racial injustice that permeated the legal system. The trials were characterized by rushed procedures, lack of proper defense, and overwhelming bias, ensuring that these men were condemned not on the basis of facts, but on the color of their skin and the threat they posed to the existing power structure. It was not until 1923, after years of legal battles and advocacy, that the U.S. Supreme Court intervened in the landmark case Moore v. Dempsey. The court overturned the convictions of the 12 men, recognizing the gross violations of due process and shining a light on the systemic racism embedded in the judicial proceedings. This case would become a significant moment in the fight for civil rights, highlighting the critical need for legal protections and equal justice under the law. The Elaine massacre stands as a powerful example of how economic struggles for fairness intersected with racial violence in the post-World War I South. The sharecroppers' demand for fair wages was not merely a labor dispute but a direct challenge to the deeply rooted racial hierarchy that sought to keep black Americans subjugated and powerless. The brutal response from white landowners, law enforcement, and vigilantes sent a chilling message to black communities throughout the South. Any attempt to assert rights or challenge white authority would be met with lethal force. This massacre also underscores the broader themes of the Red Summer, revealing how racial violence was often systematically orchestrated and supported by institutions rather than being the result of spontaneous conflicts. The complicity of law enforcement and the legal system in both the violence and its aftermath illustrates how deeply ingrained white supremacy was in American society. It reminds us that the struggle for justice during this period was not just a battle against individual acts of hatred but against an entire system designed to maintain racial inequality. Despite the terror and injustice, the courage of the black sharecroppers and their communities shines through as a testament to resilience and hope. Their willingness to organize, speak out, and demand dignity in the face of overwhelming odds laid important groundwork for future civil rights activism. The Elaine massacre's legacy is one of both profound sorrow and enduring strength, highlighting the costs of racial and economic oppression and the unyielding spirit of those who fought back. By remembering and reflecting on the Elaine massacre, we deepen our understanding of America's history of racial violence and the complex struggles that have shaped the nation's path toward equality. This tragic event calls us to acknowledge the painful realities of the past, to honor those who suffered and resisted, and to commit ourselves to building a future where justice and fairness prevail for all. In the midst of the violent upheavals that swept across America during the Red Summer of 1919, the role of the media was both powerful and profoundly troubling, as white-dominated newspapers and publications played a critical part in fueling the flames of racial tension rather than calming them. The press, which was largely controlled by white editors and owners, sensationalized stories about alleged black criminality and violence, often without verification or evidence, casting African American communities as dangerous, unruly mobs that threatened the social order. These portrayals were not accidental but carefully constructed narratives that tapped into the deep fears and prejudices of white audiences, reinforcing existing stereotypes and justifying the brutal actions taken against black Americans during this turbulent period. Newspapers of the time frequently published headlines and articles that exaggerated or distorted events, framing the violence as a necessary response to supposed black aggression. Reports would often highlight alleged assaults by black men on white women, a trope that had long been used to stoke racial hatred and fear. These stories were rarely balanced with accounts of white mob violence or the systemic injustices faced by African Americans, creating a skewed and dangerous perception of the racial conflicts. In many cases, the media not only ignored the context of black communities defending themselves against attacks, but also painted them as the instigators of disorder, further inflaming public opinion against them. This biased coverage had real and devastating consequences. It legitimized the actions of white mobs and law enforcement who targeted black neighborhoods with violence and destruction, making it seem as though such brutality was warranted to maintain law and order. The press's role in perpetuating these harmful myths helped to silence the voices of black Americans and delegitimize their demands for justice, equality, and basic human rights. By casting black citizens as villains and threats, the media contributed to a climate of fear and hatred that made peaceful resolution and understanding nearly impossible. Films and other forms of popular media also played a significant role in this dangerous narrative. For instance, the 1915 film The Birth of a Nation glorified the Ku Klux Klan and depicted black men as violent predators, cementing racist imagery in the public consciousness. This portrayal was echoed in newspapers and magazines, reinforcing the idea that black empowerment was a threat that needed to be violently suppressed. The synergy between different media forms amplified the toxic stereotypes and deepened divisions within American society. In contrast to the white-dominated press, black-owned newspapers like the Chicago Defender, The Crisis, and the New York Age emerged as vital voices of truth and resistance. These publications sought to provide accurate accounts of the violence and racial injustice, highlighting the experiences and perspectives of African Americans during the Red Summer. They documented the courage of black communities defending themselves, exposed the failures and complicity of law enforcement, and challenged the prevailing racist narratives that dominated mainstream media. These black newspapers became powerful tools for advocacy, education, and mobilization, helping to galvanize the growing civil rights movement. The contrasting narratives between white and black media during this period illustrate the critical role that journalism plays in shaping public understanding and social dynamics. The white press' sensationalism and bias did not merely report events. It actively shaped the environment in which violence and discrimination flourished. By spreading misinformation and fear, the media became a participant in the systemic oppression of black Americans, rather than a neutral observer or agent of justice. This period also highlights the dangers of unchecked media power and the importance of diverse voices in telling the full story of any event or conflict. The Red Summer's legacy reminds us that the way stories are told can either perpetuate harm or promote healing and understanding. It urges modern audiences to critically examine the sources of their information and to seek out perspectives that have historically been marginalized or silenced. Understanding the media's role in the Red Summer of 1919 helps to explain why the events of that summer have often been overlooked or misunderstood in mainstream history. The biased and sensationalized coverage contributed to a collective amnesia about the true causes and consequences of the racial violence, allowing white supremacy to maintain its grip on public memory and discourse. By confronting these uncomfortable truths, we can better appreciate the complexity of America's racial history and recognize the ongoing struggle to achieve justice and equality. Reflecting on this aspect of the Red Summer encourages us to recognize the power of narrative and the responsibility that comes with telling stories about race, conflict, and history. It calls for a commitment to truth, fairness, and inclusion in media and public discourse, ensuring that all voices are heard and respected. The lessons of 1919 are as relevant today as ever, reminding us that combating prejudice and promoting understanding begins with honest and equitable storytelling. During the Red Summer of 1919, a time when racial violence erupted across more than 36 American cities, one of the most troubling realities was the role played by law enforcement agencies. Instead of acting as protectors of all citizens and upholding the rule of law, many police forces and local authorities either stood by passively as white mobs unleashed terror on black neighborhoods or, in even more alarming cases, actively sided with the perpetrators of violence. This failure of justice not only allowed the bloodsheds to escalate, but also revealed the deep systemic racism embedded within institutions that were supposed to serve and protect every member of society equally. In cities like Chicago and Washington, D.C., eyewitness accounts and reports reveal that police officers often turned a blind eye when white rioters looted, burned, and attacked black residents and their homes, rather than intervening to stop the violence. Some law enforcement officials ignored cries for help or, worse, participated in the harassment and intimidation of black citizens. This betrayal of duty made it clear that for many officers, maintaining white supremacy took precedence over preserving peace and justice. Black communities, which sought protection and fairness from those sworn to uphold the law, found themselves exposed and vulnerable in the face of brutal aggression. The complicity of law enforcement was not limited to passive inaction. In some instances, police forces helped enforce segregation and racial oppression by arresting black individuals who defended themselves or tried to resist attacks, while simultaneously allowing white mobs to act with impunity. This double standard created an environment where African Americans were criminalized for seeking justice and safety, deepening mistrust between black communities and the authorities. The courts often compounded this injustice by handing down harsh sentences to black defendants, as seen in the aftermath of events like the Elaine massacre, where 12 black men were wrongly sentenced to death in sham trials despite evidence that they acted in self-defense. The involvement of law enforcement in the violence was a reflection of the broader societal attitudes of the time. Many officers were products of their communities, holding the same racist beliefs that fueled white supremacy and segregation. Their actions were often influenced by political pressures and social norms that prioritized the protection of white citizens' interests above all else. This institutional bias was a stark contradiction to the ideals of justice and equality that the nation claimed to uphold, and highlighted the deep fractures in American society. Moreover, the failure of police and local governments to control or condemn the violence sent a chilling message to Black Americans. It underscored that their safety, rights, and lives were not guaranteed, even under the protection of law. This lack of accountability emboldened white mobs, who operated with a sense of impunity, knowing that their actions would likely go unpunished. The resulting atmosphere of fear and insecurity further marginalized Black communities, hindering progress and reinforcing cycles of poverty and discrimination. The role of federal authorities during the Red Summer was equally complex. In some cases, federal troops were eventually deployed to restore order, but often only after significant damage had been done and numerous lives lost. The delayed intervention reflected both logistical challenges and political reluctance to confront the systemic nature of racial violence directly. When federal forces did arrive, their presence sometimes helped quell the unrest, but it did little to address the root causes or bring justice to victims. The systemic issues of racial bias within law enforcement and governance remained largely unchallenged, setting the stage for continued struggles in the decades to come. Despite these overwhelming obstacles, Black communities did not remain passive. Many African Americans organized their own neighborhood watches and defense groups, particularly Black veterans who had served in World War I and were determined to protect their families and homes. These acts of self-defense were not only a practical response to immediate threats, but also a powerful assertion of dignity and resistance against oppression. Yet, even in defending themselves, Black citizens faced arrest and persecution, highlighting the harsh realities of a system stacked against them. The failure of law enforcement to protect Black Americans during the Red Summer of 1919 must be understood not as isolated incidents, but as part of a broader pattern of systemic racism that permeated American institutions. This pattern extended beyond policing to include the judicial system, political structures, and social norms that maintained racial hierarchies. The events of 1919 exposed these injustices in stark relief and spurred the efforts of civil rights organizations like the NAACP to demand reforms and federal legislation aimed at protecting Black lives and rights. Looking back, the lessons from this painful chapter remind us of the critical importance of accountability, justice, and reform within law enforcement agencies. They underscore the need for a policing system that serves all citizens fairly and protects vulnerable communities, rather than perpetuating cycles of discrimination and violence. The history of the Red Summer calls on us to confront uncomfortable truths about institutional bias and to work tirelessly toward building a society where every individual, regardless of race, can live in safety and dignity. Understanding the role of law enforcement during the Red Summer also helps contextualize ongoing conversations about policing and racial justice today. It reminds us that these issues are deeply rooted in history, and that meaningful change requires acknowledging past failures, learning from them, and committing to equity and fairness in the present and future. The courage of Black communities who resisted violence despite these challenges continues to inspire efforts toward justice and equality, serving as a powerful testament to resilience and hope amid adversity. Amid the widespread violence and injustice that marked the Red Summer of 1919, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, better known as the NAACP, emerged as a vital force advocating for Black Americans' rights and dignity in a country rife with racial turmoil. As cities burned and Black communities faced attacks from white mobs, law enforcement, and sometimes even the government, The NAACP understood that this was not merely a series of isolated incidents but a deeply rooted crisis demanding organized resistance, documentation, and legislative action. Their response during and after this dark summer would become a crucial turning point in the ongoing fight for civil rights and justice in America. The NAACP's strategy was multifaceted, recognizing that combating racial violence required more than public outrage. It necessitated meticulous gathering of evidence and a systematic approach to advocacy. Activists and lawyers within the organization traveled to riot-affected cities, interviewing survivors, collecting eyewitness accounts, and documenting the widespread atrocities committed against black citizens. This documentation was essential not only to preserve the truth amid widespread misinformation and biased media narratives but also to build a case that could be presented to lawmakers and the courts. By capturing the scale and systematic nature of the violence, the NAACP laid bare the extent of racial oppression that many preferred to ignore or deny. One of the most important avenues the NAACP pursued was the push for federal anti-lynching legislation. Lynching had long been a horrific tool of racial terror used to enforce white supremacy across the South and beyond. Although local and state governments often turned a blind eye or even tacitly approved such acts, the NAACP sought to make lynching a federal crime that would bring national attention and consequences to perpetrators. They saw this legislation as a critical step toward protecting black lives and challenging the culture of impunity that allowed racial violence to flourish. Despite facing fierce opposition, particularly from Southern Democrats who wielded significant power in Congress, the NAACP remained steadfast in their campaign. They organized petitions, rallied public opinion, and used their publications to raise awareness about the urgent need for change. Their efforts culminated in the introduction of anti-lynching bills in Congress, which, although passed in the House of Representatives, were ultimately blocked in the Senate. This setback, while deeply frustrating, did not diminish the NAACP's resolve. Rather, it galvanized the organization to continue its fight on multiple fronts. The NAACP's activism during the Red Summer also marked a significant evolution in black political engagement. Leaders like E.B. Du Bois and James Weldon Johnson harnessed the momentum created by the riots to push for greater political representation, legal reforms, and civil rights protections. The organization's work during this period helped to build a national network of activists and supporters who would later become central figures in the civil rights movement of the mid-20th century. The Red Summer was thus not only a moment of violence and tragedy, but also a catalyst for a more organized and determined struggle against racial injustice. Importantly, the NAACP's efforts went beyond legal and political battles. They also provided a crucial psychological and moral support system for black communities traumatized by the events. By speaking out against the violence and advocating for justice, the organization helped to restore a sense of hope and empowerment. Their publications, including the Crisis magazine, served as platforms to tell the real stories behind the headlines, countering the distorted images propagated by much of the white-dominated press. These narratives highlighted the resilience, courage, and dignity of black Americans in the face of relentless adversity. The documentation and advocacy work done by the NAACP during the Red Summer were instrumental in changing how racial violence was understood and addressed in the United States. They challenged the notion that such violence was spontaneous or justified and instead exposed it as a calculated and systemic effort to maintain white supremacy. This framing shifted the conversation toward recognizing the need for structural change, including federal intervention and stronger protections for civil rights. Though immediate legislative victories were limited, the groundwork laid by the NAACP during this period set important precedents for future civil rights advocacy. Their insistence on federal responsibility for protecting black citizens and holding perpetrators accountable would echo through decades of struggle, culminating in landmark legislation such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Red Summer was an early and painful chapter in this long journey. But thanks to the NAACP's tireless efforts, it became a catalyst for progress rather than a forgotten tragedy. Reflecting on the NAACP's role in the Red Summer highlights the power of organized, persistent activism in the face of overwhelming odds. It reminds us that progress often requires documenting truth, challenging entrenched systems, and mobilizing communities around shared goals of justice and equality. The courage and determination displayed by the NAACP during this tumultuous time continue to inspire contemporary movements that seek to address racial injustice and inequality in America today. In understanding this crucial role, we see that the fight against racial violence and discrimination is not just about confronting individual acts of hate, but dismantling the systemic forces that enable them. The NAACP's response during the Red Summer exemplifies how strategic advocacy, legal action, and community empowerment can converge to create lasting change. Their story teaches us that even amid darkness and despair, the seeds of hope and justice can take root and flourish, shaping a better future for generations to come. As we come to the close of this exploration into the Red Summer of 1919, it is clear that this turbulent chapter in American history was more than just a series of isolated riots. It was a powerful, if painful, revelation of the deep systemic racism that permeated the social, economic, and political fabric of the nation. The violence and upheaval that unfolded across more than 36 cities were symptoms of a much larger problem, one that had been festering for decades and would continue to challenge the United States for many years to come. The Red Summer exposed the harsh realities faced by African Americans, the unfulfilled promises of equality after World War I, the economic competition fueled by the Great Migration, and the brutal enforcement of white supremacy through violent mobs, biased law enforcement, and a media that often distorted the truth. It showed how racism was not just personal prejudice, but a system embedded in institutions and power structures that sought to maintain a racial hierarchy at any cost. Yet, amid this darkness, the courage and resilience of Black communities shone brightly. Their resistance, self-defense, and the determined activism of organizations like the NAACP laid critical groundwork for the civil rights struggles that would follow decades later. Though many of these stories have been overshadowed or forgotten in mainstream narratives, remembering the Red Summer helps us understand the roots of ongoing racial issues in America and the importance of confronting these truths honestly. Thank you so much for watching and taking the time to learn about this crucial, often overlooked part of our history. If you found this story meaningful, insightful, or thought-provoking, please do not forget to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss out on more important stories that matter. Your support helps us continue creating content that shines a light on history's hidden chapters and fosters understanding in our present. We hope this video has inspired you to think critically about history and its impact on today's society, and to appreciate the strength of those who fought for justice in the face of tremendous adversity. Remember, learning from the past is one of the most powerful ways we can shape a more just and equitable future for all.